So guys, we're going to do something a little bit different on the channel today because unless you've been under a rock for the last week or so, you've probably heard that Baldur's Gate 3 just came out. And while we don't really talk about RPG games much on this channel, if at all, so you probably wouldn't know that Baldur's Gate is actually one of my favorite game franchises of all time. Now, if you've heard anything about this game so far, well, you've probably heard that it's a contender for Game of the Year, and some people are also saying that it's redefined the RPG genre. Not just that though, but the stats don't lie. It's sitting at about 96% positive reviews on Steam, and it's at 97 on Metacritic. So what could I possibly have to say bad about this one? Well guys, this is BillyEatWorld again, and let's find out. Alright guys, how you going? Welcome to the video, and first up I just want to mention that the gameplay you can see in the background of this video isn't of Baldur's Gate 3, it's of Baldur's Gate 2, and look, that's intentional. The reason why I want to show you guys this game is because there's a really good chance you've never played it before, and it's important that you guys see it, because what I want to focus on in this video is not all the things that make Baldur's Gate 3 great or bad or whatever. I just want to focus on why it's different from Baldur's Gate 2 specifically, and it's important that you can see what Baldur's Gate 2 looks like. Now, the other thing I should mention is that before BG3, we hadn't actually seen a new numbered game in the franchise for over 2 decades. But in saying that, all of the main games had been remastered since then, and the prequel game, Siege of Dragonspear, came out back in 2016. But look, even though the franchise wasn't technically dead when BG3 was announced, I think it's safe to say the Infinity engine was looking pretty dated at that point, and honestly, even though the gameplay and the story still holds up from the original games, it was probably about time the franchise got a reboot. Now, I think if you're this far through the video, you probably have heard about Baldur's Gate before, but if you haven't for some reason, well, it's actually based on D&D, and more specifically, it's based on D&D's Forgotten Realms campaign setting, which is a campaign setting that dates all the way back to the late 1960s. And part of the reason I think Baldur's Gate 3 has been so successful is because this isn't a new universe. This is a deep and a rich and complex world that extends way beyond a single video game franchise. Not just that, but D&D is a deep and complex game system in its own right, and a lot of people I think are experiencing it for the first time with Baldur's Gate 3, and they're realizing how addictive Forgotten Realms plus 5th edition can be, which is exactly the same impact that Baldur's Gate 1 had back in the 90s. It's something that when you first experience it, you'll never ever forget it. So what's the issue then? Well, if you speak to anyone who's played D&D before and has also played Baldur's Gate, well, they're going to tell you that it was one of the best D&D games ever released. But the problem is, Baldur's Gate never really felt like tabletop D&D, and there's a good reason for that. Tabletop D&D is very slow-paced, and it's way deeper than any video game could have gone back in the 90s. It's kind of like the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek, right? Star Wars is clearly focused on action, and Star Trek is a bit more centered around relationships and finding ways for solving problems without violence. And it's pretty clear that the developers of the original Baldur's Gate games had to put the focus on action, which was fine for the time, but in doing so they sacrificed a lot of what makes tabletop D&D so great. Now, fast forward to 2023, when it's possible to put 174 hours of cinematic cutscenes into a game, where it's possible to have the whole cast voice acted and motion captured. It makes sense that the new developer Larian Studios would take another stab at translating the authentic tabletop D&D experience, right? And in that respect, I think they have succeeded. Look, a lot of the nuance of the tabletop game just isn't there, obviously, but BG3 is probably the closest thing we've ever seen, and I don't think most people would disagree with that. Because, I mean, you can even see the animation of the dice rolls, and there's even a narrator describing your actions, just like a DM would in tabletop D&D. And a few people have said to me this week, it's almost perfect. And if you're a D&D fan, it probably is. So once again, what's the problem? Well, it's got ridiculous amounts of content. It's authentic to D&D. It's a really good D&D game, but it's not a Baldur's Gate game. And it kills me to say it, that this is probably the best D&D simulator I've ever played that completely fails to capture the essence of the original game, which I fell in love with, which was focused on faster-paced action. Hopefully you're picking up by now that the combat in BG2 is real-time with the ability to pause and assign actions, whereas Baldur's Gate 3's combat is locked to traditional turn-based D&D format. And look, in simple terms, what that really means is that encounters in Baldur's Gate 2 can last about 30 seconds, whereas encounters can last 5 minutes or more in Baldur's Gate 3. And that, at that point, is not really an action-focused game. Now, you can make the argument that Baldur's Gate 2's combat style is outdated, but that's not true. Plenty of spiritual successors have come out over the years, like Dragon Age and Pillars of Eternity, and they've been successful. And you can also make the argument that Baldur's Gate would have been closer to the tabletop games if they had have been able to make it possible back in the day, except that it wasn't. What we got was the Baldur's Gate that we've got, and it will always be that way. And you can also make the argument that Larian are just doing what they do best, which is turn-based combat from their Divinity games, except that this isn't Divinity 3. And you can also make the argument that it's really not that important to pay respect to the original games, as long as the new game is good, right? So if that's the case, then why did they call it Baldur's Gate in the first place? I think what has really happened here is that Wizards of the Coast, the current owners of the D&D franchise, they looked at Larian's previous work and they thought, that looks like something that we could turn into D&D. And they also looked at the history of D&D games and realized that Baldur's Gate was really the only franchise that stood the test of time and the only one that still had widespread brand recognition. So it's really not rocket science to figure out why Wizards of the Coast put 2 and 2 together and realized they could make a lot of money from not only licensing a reboot to Baldur's Gate, but also hopefully generating a lot of new interest in their tabletop game. But what I can't understand is that why no one at Larian stopped and said, hey, maybe we should probably make a game that at least kind of plays like the originals, you know, to justify that we're making a numbered sequel in the franchise and that there's millions of players out there that remember and love those games for what they are. The thing is, they probably still could have done their own thing, at least if they added options to make the pacing faster like in classic Baldur's Gate games. For example, an option to switch between turn-based and real-time combat. And they could have added options to, for example, turn off the animations for dice rolls and the narrator, which are cute and authentic to tabletop D&D, but are also not immersive, and they're very time-consuming in a video game format. And look, I get it. The argument that people make to that point all the time is, well, this is D&D 5th edition and real-time just isn't going to work in 5e. So once again, why call this game Baldur's Gate 3 if you can't make it feel like a Baldur's Gate game? And I don't want to think they just didn't care, but that seems like the logical answer. So at the end of the day, what we've ended up with is probably the best D&D game ever made. A game that is genre redefining, maybe industry redefining in that it's taking a stand against microtransactions, and yet it doesn't feel anything like the game it was inspired by, which is so sad. And to be honest, borderline heartbreaking, because I have tried so hard to play more of Baldur's Gate 3 this week, and I just can't do it. I can't boot it up. I'm not a fan of turn-based RPGs, and I never have been. The reason I loved Baldur's Gate 1 and Baldur's Gate 2 is because they weren't slow-paced. And despite the fact that I had a ton of people telling me this week, well, BG3 isn't that slow. If you're not someone that plays turn-based games a lot, it really is that slow. I mean, turn-based games are just slow by design. That's how they work. But look, I still have hope, whether it be Larian themselves or community modders. I really hope someone takes the criticisms coming from the fans of the original games at least a little bit seriously and adds some of these quality of life features. I'm not asking the devs to rip the heart out of their own game. What I'm asking them to do is pay attention to what made the first 2 games magic to begin with. And this is the most important thing. I want to like this game. This is probably my favorite RPG franchise of all time. I don't want to be frustrated about this. But in my opinion, if you can put 17,000 endings and 174 hours of cinematics into a game, surely there's someone that can figure out how to make the veteran fans happy. I mean, at least just give us a feature that allows us to switch into real-time combat. It wouldn't be the first game that's done it. And with a dev team and the sort of resources that Larian has, I'm sure they can do it. And I just hope that they do. But anyway, guys, that just about wraps this one up. And I know this is an unpopular opinion. If you do feel the need to dislike this video, go right ahead. But in saying that, if you did like this video, please check out the links in the description down below for all my socials. And always remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you guys in the next one.